In today's video, I have 10 tips for you that are going to give you more control over your watercolors. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel I teach all things watercolor as well as drawing, mixed media, even a bit of business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a new video for you and make at least one free video a week here on YouTube with extra content for Patreon subscribers. So let's talk briefly about having control over your watercolors. Now, I'm not talking about control in the idea of being really tight, really controlled with your painting. I'm talking about simply getting the watercolors to do what you want them to do, whether that's a loose painting style or a more detailed painting style. What you don't want is for them to be doing things and you just don't know how they're working. You're putting stuff on your paper and you're just hoping for the best. Or if you find that you're going through a painting and you find that there comes a stage where you've just lost control of things, that might mean that you've got drying lines and backgrounds that you didn't want. It might mean that the tones are off, the techniques didn't come out as you wanted, or perhaps the colors aren't quite right. Now, there's a term that's thrown about all the time with watercolor painting, and that's happy accidents. I think actually it might have been coined originally by Bob Ross. And it's the idea that something could just happen on your painting and it can end up looking really good. Now that's great, it's great when that happens, but to my mind, the more happy accidents you have, the more unhappy accidents you're going to have as well along the way. And personally, I would rather be in control of my paint and know what it's going to do. And all of those happy accidents you think look so pretty, they can all be done on purpose. So as I said, it's not about tight controlled painting, it's about getting the paint to do what you want it to do and not losing control of the direction of your painting as you go through it. I've got some really simple tips today that are going to help you do just that. Because trust me, it is possible to control what watercolors do. You don't have to just throw them randomly on your paper and hope for the best. So my first tip for you is to work flat most of the time. In other words, don't use an easel, don't tip your paper up. I wouldn't even have it at a slight angle. Now, there are lots of people that will tell you that it's better to paint at a slight angle, and certainly there can be advantages to tipping your paper up for a short amount of time. It may be that you want to spread a wash downwards. I used to use that technique actually for getting rain clouds looking like it's raining, so there are reasons why you might tip your paper up. You might find it very hard to draw on a flat surface. I've spent years doing it, so I'm quite used to it, but if you find that, it's really hard to draw your initial underdrawing on a flat surface, feel free to tip it up or use an easel. But when it comes to the actual watercolor painting, I suggest that you work flat most of the time. Now, what I've got when I paint is I've actually got a high table. I work on a high table with a stool. And I do from time to time stand up, particularly if I need to get to the top of the picture. I do also take regular breaks and exercise, do neck rotations, things like that, in order to avoid getting neck ache from constantly looking down. It's a bit like always looking down at your phone, you end up with an aching neck, don't you? So of course there are these disadvantages to working flat, but why do I suggest that you do it? Well, it's quite simply this. Controlling watercolor is all about controlling water levels and moisture levels. Now, if you add gravity into that, you are definitely making it harder. Now, I have a lot of experience on working on easels, even with watercolors. Now, why do I have this experience when I don't recommend it? It's because for years I was demonstrating to art clubs and art societies and at fairs and exhibitions. Even in my local art shop, I used to do demos for them. And sometimes they would insist that I use an easel so that the audience could see. They would do one of two things. They'd either have a camera pointing straight down with a projector. Now, a lot of you on YouTube would like me to point the camera straight down when I'm drawing and painting. But what you don't realize is that if you do that, you tend to lean in front of it. So working with a projector wasn't, the easiest thing either, because then you have to be so careful that you don't sort of lean forwards and get your head or another part of your anatomy in front of the camera. But working on an easel actually was far worse. Now, I did find ways of making it work. And I used to do things like large seascapes and things where you don't need to do quite as much detail, or by contrast, you could do something with much finer detail where you're using less water. Now, you could, for example, do botanical work at an easel. You wouldn't be using as much water in as large an area, so it would be a little bit easier. But the fact remains that if you add gravity to your watercolor painting, things are going to run downwards. And unless, as I said, for a short amount of time you need that to happen, I suggest that you always work flat. So my second tip is a controversial one, and that is that you should always stretch your paper, or at least work on a watercolor block. That's a pad of paper that's been gummed almost all of the way round, and it helps to stop the paper from buckling. Now, sometimes people talk about stretched paper as if it only matters about the end result. In other words, you want a nice flat piece of paper at the end, which you certainly will get with stretched paper. But what some people don't realize is that working on unstretched paper actually negatively affects how you apply the paint and how easy it is to control the paint. So I'm going to point the camera downwards now and give you a demonstration of how important water levels are and how this is affected by paper that buckles or cockles, and how stretched paper or a watercolor block can assist you in controlling your paint. So here's a painting that I started some time ago, and it's been left to dry, so it's dry now, and it's on stretched paper, so you can see that it's completely flat. Now, when I was painting on it, the paper did buckle slightly, but a lot less than if I was working on unstretched paper. Now, I set this painting aside because it was actually a YouTube tutorial which was going to be how to paint a landscape with just 3 colours, and unfortunately the camera stopped working when I did part of the sky. Of course, I can't take the paint off again, so I was kind of unsure what to do with it. I may do the foreground as a tutorial. I may also refilm how to paint a landscape with 3 colours. Let me know if you'd like any of those tutorials. Anyway, meantime, here it sits, and you can see that it's dead flat, and it was a lot flatter than unstretched paper whilst I was working on it. So let's look at why this makes a difference to how you paint. So I've got a scrap of paper here, and as I start to apply the paint, what happens is the paper stretches. So where the paper's wet, it expands and it will start to stretch. And eventually it will start to curve upwards. Let's put some more water on it, see if we can start getting that effect to take place. Now, if I press on it with the handle of the brush, hopefully you can see that it started to bow upwards. Now, of course, because the paper's curved, what starts to happen is that the paint settles around the edge, or it may settle off to one side if it hasn't bowed evenly. On a larger painting, you'll get ripples, and within the ripples, you'll get puddles. Now, where you have puddles, you'll have uneven drying. Now, wet paint and puddles are attracted to damp areas. Can you see this paint here? I've done it a different colour so you can see how it's bleeding out. Now, it looks quite pretty. Of course, you can use effects like this to your advantage. You can do them on purpose. What I'm talking about here is getting them by accident, having areas, where there's just too much water and everything dries and you start to get drying lines. So in order to minimise uneven drying, in order to minimize puddles, and I'm going to show you later on how to get rid of puddles while you're painting. But in order to minimize this happening in the first place, in order to stop the paint settling in those dips of the paper, we need to keep the paper as flat as possible, and stretching your paper is the best way to do that. Don't worry if you've been told that it's time consuming or tricky. It's actually really, really simple. It does in fact save you money. I can stretch a piece of paper in less time than it takes me to make a cup of tea, and I'm British, so we can make tea really, really fast. I'll leave a link in the description of this video to the video that I made about how to stretch your paper quickly and easily. It'll only take you about 20 minutes to watch the video, and then you'll be ready to go. You'll understand the process fully, and you'll be able to reduce the amount that your paper is bowing and stretching like this and causing puddles to form, which are going to lead you to lose control of how the paint is drying. At this point, as always, can I ask you very quickly to do me a favour? If you're enjoying this video, could you click the thumbs up button for me? YouTube rewards videos with audience interaction, so if you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people. I can teach more people how to paint and draw. I'm trying to get the channel to 100,000 subscribers. I've got 88,000 at the moment, which is absolutely astonishing. I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me here on YouTube. So one of the things that's so important when controlling watercolours is using the right size brush and indeed the right shape of brush. This is where sometimes people go wrong. They often think they'll have more control by going to a smaller brush. It's not always the case. And there are a few brush shapes as well that just won't give you any control over the watercolour that you're putting on the paper. So let's look next at brushes. So look at all these brushes, aren't they great? Lots of different shapes and sizes. We can do all sorts of things with brushes like this. But I want you to understand that for the majority of your painting, you'll probably be using a brush like this. This is called a round brush. It does have a point, but it's round here at the metal part, the ferrule, which is why it's called a round brush. And you'll be using this for maybe 80% of your painting. The majority of the rest of your painting, you might be using a large flat brush like this. Sometimes you might need a smaller round brush like this for details. And then very occasionally you might need one of these odd shaped brushes for particular special techniques. Brushes like this one here really aren't very useful This is what's called a filbert, so it's a flat brush with a rounded end. It's not very big. It's great for oil painting and acrylics. You can get some nice soft marks with it. You can use it for watercolor painting for things like loose backgrounds, but you can see just by the shape of it, you're not going to be able to be very precise with it. Now, many people think going to a smaller brush like this is going to give you more precision. And certainly it could if you're painting a very fine detail like the centre of a flower. But there's a disadvantage with a small brush like this, and that is that it doesn't hold much water. So if you're filling in a larger area, you're going to have to keep dipping in the paint. Now, we've just learned about how difficult it is if you get uneven water levels on your paper. And one of the surest ways of getting uneven water levels on your paper is to have to keep dipping in and out, picking up more water, stopping and starting. It's not a great way of getting a smooth, even application. As I said, this brush is great for doing tiny little details, but for painting larger areas, you're not going to have any control. In fact, you're going to get the opposite. Now contrast it with a large brush like this, and we can get a much smoother application because a brush like this just keeps on going because it holds so much more paint. So while we're on the subject of brushes and brush strokes, let's look at painting clean edges. There are a couple of mistakes that beginners often make with this. Now, we've talked about having enough paint on your brush to run a smooth paint line, but there's also the actual way that you apply the paint, and this is sometimes where beginners go wrong. It's a really simple thing to fix. So let's look at this idea of painting along edges. Maybe it's a straight edge like this or a curved edge like this, and we want to get a smooth, even line. What you need to do is you need to paint along the line. Now that may seem, well, of course you paint along the line, but actually I see so many people and they're working on a larger painting and they've ended up with some small little brush and they're coming up, so they're painting like this and they're almost painting from the wrong side, and they can't even, because of the position of their hand, they can't even see the edge they're painting along. Now I have to keep my tutorials still. I can't move the board because I'm filming them for you. However, if I'm painting in real life, I would be moving myself or moving the board around. If you can't see the edge that you're painting up to, if you're just prodding at it from the side with a tiny brush, you're not going to get a neat application. Another way this can go wrong, I'm just going to put some very watery paint on this side here. Another way this can go wrong is if you haven't allowed an area to dry. So you've got this nice edge and you think, oh, I'll just paint that edge there and let's go round in a nice neat line here. And look what happens. Again, the damp paint is being drawn across into that semi-dry area and it's all going wrong. So as well as using a brush that's large enough, you have to make sure the area, the other side of the edge you're painting is dry and that you're going along your straight edges, not prodding at them sideways. And above all, make sure that you can see the tip of your brush. So my next tip when painting with watercolors and getting more control is to follow the rule of light to dark. Now, if you're a complete beginner, you may not have heard of this, and it's simply born out of the fact that you can't put lights on top of darks with watercolor. So for instance, if you painted a dark area, say you were painting a black dog, you couldn't then put white spots on top without going into gouache or acrylic or some opaque medium. And so therefore you kind of work backwards with watercolors and you work light to dark. Now, if you're not a complete beginner, you probably already know this rule. You think, well, I already know this rule, Michelle, but how often do you stick to it? Or do you end up just sort of going off course? And about halfway through the painting, you start randomly going into darker shades without thinking about it too much. I find that this often happens when people get confused about colour mixing. They'll see a colour, say a light grey or a beige or something, not really too sure how to mix that colour, so they think, oh, I don't know about that. Oh, look at that bright red thing, I'll paint that first. And this is where you go wrong. Now, as a side note, you should realise that any colour with red in, that includes orange and purple, is a little bit more prone to running when you go up to the edge of it. And the light to dark rule will get you out of most sticky situations, especially if you're looking at something. I see people say to me things like, do I paint the background first or the foreground? Now, there's no correct answer to that. It depends on so many factors, including the subject. But if you're uncertain, then go back to your light to dark rule. Is the background lighter than the foreground? Then maybe put it in first. If it's the other way round, then leave it till later. As you become a more experienced artist, you'll be able to push this rule a little bit to the side. For instance, it's a complete myth that you have to work an area, a single area, up from light to dark individually. In other words, you can't have a dark without having multiple layers of paint. You absolutely can go straight in with dark paint, but it's more a matter of at what stage of the painting you apply those darks, and you want to make sure you put them at the end. It's also really difficult to judge how dark things should be if you haven't got all of the other tones in first. So by having a few of these structures around your painting methods, you'll get yourself out of trouble. The one slight exception to this rule, I would say, is in landscapes when you want to put the sky in first. But actually with the composition of most landscapes, you're still generally working light to dark, and you want to sort of fade your sky so it's a bit lighter towards the horizon. You can get those darker elements on top afterwards. So if you're ever looking at your painting and thinking, well, I don't know how to start, or if you're looking at it halfway through and thinking, I don't know what to do next, go back to the rule of light to dark. It's going to get you out of so much trouble. Now, my next tip is something that I see amateur artists and beginners do all the time. And it's not actually a painting mistake, but it's born out of not just impatience, but also kind of a misunderstanding of the way you go through the process of a painting. And it's absolutely not your fault, because as a beginner, you tend to do one of two things. You go to classes or you watch videos on the internet. Now, both of these are liable to give you the impression that painting should be done far more quickly than it is. And you don't see the process that most professional artists go through of leaving things to dry between layers and actually just stepping away from their work to see what it needs next and to think about things. Now, if you go to a class and it's, for example, 2 hours long, I used to teach many such classes. I've taught thousands of classes to students that have been an hour and a half or 2 hours long, or perhaps a day workshop. And there's kind of a feeling, isn't there, that you want to get a finished piece of work. And that absolutely is understandable. And I don't blame you at all when you're in a class like that, in a class situation, for rushing your work a little bit to get to the end. Now, something similar almost happens when you're watching an art video, and that's due to the editing process. So I may be doing a painting tutorial on YouTube, and I might say to you, right, you need to let that layer dry now. You need to let the sky dry before you carry on. Now, of course, all you see then is a millisecond before I start painting again. You don't see how long I actually leave that layer to dry. You might think it's 5 or 10 minutes. It might actually be 2 or 3 days because of my life and the filming schedule. I might actually have put that aside, gone off to a martial arts class, gone through the night, got up next day, gone to the supermarket, done some admin, gone back to the painting. But when you're watching that tutorial, it's just a millisecond. Now, all professional artists take their work quite seriously, and at every stage they'll stop and have a think about it. There's also a thing that happens when you're looking at your work up close for a long time. You lose the ability to see it. So what professional artists will do is they'll stop working. They'll put their work up on a shelf, maybe like this one behind me. They'll step away from it and they'll look at it at some distance. And if possible, they'll actually take a break. So they'll go off, have a cup of tea or something, come back half an hour or an hour later. It enables you to see the piece of work afresh. It gives things time to dry. Watercolor paints actually contain gum arabic and other binders which stick them to your paper. So in any complex sky, I will work in layers and I will allow that sky to dry completely, fully, multiple times before going back into it. And this is something that you can miss or just not understand if you've only gone to sort of short classes where everybody's always rushing to get their work finished, or if you just watch videos like mine that are edited to keep them a reasonable length for watching. So if you get to the point with your painting that everything's a little bit wet, or if you need to put another layer on a sky or a foreground, or if you're just not sure where the painting is going next, you feel like there's something wrong with it, you're just not sure what to do to it next, I want you to let it dry, leave it alone, take a break from it physically, take your eyes off of it and go for a walk or something like that and come back and look at it again. Because rushing your work and not allowing it to dry is something that gets beginners into so much trouble, and it's so easy to avoid. Doesn't require any talent, does it, just to put your work to the side and have a little break. So my next tip is to get to know your colours. You simply can't rely on that sticker on the outside of the paint tube. I also see this problem with people using pan paints. Now, there's nothing wrong with pan paints, but I can't tell you how many times I walk around an art class, had a look at people painting and they're sort of prodding at some colour, saying, I'm not quite sure what this colour is, because once you get into those darks, if the colour's not labelled or swatched, you really are just guessing. So I'm going to show you now some ways of organising your paints so that you know what they are, know what colour they are, and can always find them in the palette, because you're not going to get good results if you don't even know what colour you're using. So let's talk about keeping track of what your paint colours actually are and what they look like. So you can see this palette here just has blues and purples in. When I first started out, I had a large square palette and it had about 20 wells around the outside, and I arranged them in a certain order. I do suggest grouping your primary colours together, grouping your secondary colours together, perhaps putting things like your earth and neutral colours together. Now, I know what these colours are. I know the names of them. I don't have to look them up. I don't have to wonder, because I've been using this palette for years and I know what order they are in. If you've got block paints, in other words, pan paints, you'll find that if you lift the little blocks out, certainly if you've got any kind of decent brand of students or artist paint, if you lift the little blocks out, you should find that they are written on the side. When you first get a new set of paints, there should be a key to the colours. They should be labelled on the tubes or on the sides. A tube of paint will not only have the name, it'll have the pigment number as well, so that's something else that you can look up if you want to. If you're new to painting and you're just not used to your paints yet, something that some of my students used to do is they have the type of plastic palette where you have sort of a rim around the edge, and they used to get permanent marker pens and they would write the colour names, or at least the initials of the colours around the edge. That can help you to remember them as well. If you have a set of pan paints with a lid, you can make yourself a little card of swatches and colours in the same place where they're sitting in your paint box, so that as you lift the lid up, and if you make something like that, of course you want to put some plastic or some sellotape over the top to keep it waterproof, and then you have got a little key for all your colours. Going beyond that, you can make colour charts. So let me show you some that I made years ago. So here at the top, I've got Talon's Permanent Orange. So I've got the brand name. These are Talon's Rembrandt. I've got the colour name. And here I've just swatched my paint colour, getting lighter and lighter and lighter so I can see how it looks. This is so important. It's going to help you so much with your colour decisions. Here we have some blues, and again I've gone from dark to light. Even if you can't be bothered to go as far as this, at least swatch a sort of a medium amount of water. Swatch each of your colours on a piece of paper so that you know how they look, preferably on the same watercolour paper that you usually use. If you want to, you can take it a step further. For instance, here I have got my yellows along the top and my blues down the side, and where these meet I've made a swatch. So for instance, here I have cerulean blue mixed with cadmium yellow deep, and this is the green I get. Now within every one of these colours there are loads more colours, because I could go further into the yellow or further into the blue, or have more or less water. If you want to go down the rabbit hole of colour charts, you can go on pretty much indefinitely, but they can be so useful, especially if you struggle with colour mixing, because then you've got an exact example of what happens when you mix one of your colours with another. And at the very least, at least swatch your colour once so you can see how it looks outside of the tube or outside of the pan. Let me show you why this is so important. Look at this brownish colour here. You see how dark it looks? This colour is quinacridone gold, and it looks completely different on the paper to how it looks in the tube or pan, because it's a transparent colour, and when you see a blob of it, it looks dark brown. You can't possibly hope to choose the right colours if you don't have a good reference for how they look on the paper. So my next tip is all about brush control and using your brush to control the water levels on your painting. You're also going to need either some paper towel or a rag. I'm going to show you how to get water levels on your work a lot more even, and how to lift out excess areas of water. And we saw at the beginning of the video what trouble these can cause. I'm going to show you how to lift them out without leaving any marks. So let's look at controlling where the water sits on your paper and what to do when you have too much water on your paper and you're ending up with some kind of puddle. Let's put a few colours on here so you can see. Now, many beginners will just sort of leave it alone because they're not too sure what to do about it, or they may blot it, which is pretty disastrous because not only does it leave marks, but it also adds to the uneven drying of the paper. You see how I'm getting this puddle built up? It's often where you reach the end of a painting area, you've just got this little puddle here. It doesn't look too much trouble, but it is going to cause you problems later on, because as this part dries, it's going to sneak back in. What we need to do is to lift this water out without it showing. So I'm going to rinse my brush and I'm going to dry my brush so the brush is just damp. And what I'm going to do then is I'm just going to make little dots like this and keep wiping on the paper towel. If you don't like using paper towels, you can use a rag. Make sure it's cotton. Something like an old piece of t-shirt works well. Something like polyester really won't do the job very effective. It's not absorbent enough. Now when you place the brush on the paper, does leave a slight mark, but you see that those little areas have filled themselves in again and we get a much more smooth look. It's important just to dip the tip of your brush in. If you scrape your brush along like this, you're going to leave a much more distinct mark. Now this can be used for certain techniques, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we're just talking about controlling how much water is on your paper, not leaving puddles. And for this, you're going to clean, wipe your brush so it's semi-dry, and then just dot in any areas that look like they have too much water in, and we can get them drying nice and evenly. So we've got a wet into wet effect here. We've got two colors, but we don't have any great big drying lines or any uneven stuff going on. This area should dry quite nicely. So my next tip goes back to that idea I talked about before of professionals just being a little more thoughtful about their work as they go through it, taking time to slow down and think about things a bit more. And for this tip, I want you to always try out colours and techniques before you put them on your paper. Now, if you had wandered into one of my physical art classes about 5 years ago, you'd have seen me walking around at the start of the class, giving out little scraps of paper to people, 2 or 3 to each person, scraps of watercolour paper like this. I just keep these when I stretch my paper. I buy full sheets, it's cheaper that way, and I've got some offcuts. You can just keep some cheap watercolour paper to hand. It's quite astonishing to me how many people risk something. So they take a risk with their painting. So they have an idea that maybe they'll use a technique. What if I used masking fluid here? What if I used a bit of wax resist? What about some watercolor pencils? How about throwing some salt on? I've seen that on the internet. That looks pretty. And then just go ahead and stick it on their painting. Likewise with colours, they'll mix a colour up, apply it, it's too light, it's too dark, it's the wrong colour, it just doesn't look right. All of these things can be avoided by just getting a little scrap of paper and trying out the colour or the technique first. And always allow it to dry before making your final decision. Watercolour can dry up to 50% lighter, and things like texture techniques often don't fully develop until the paint is dry. So take that time out. Swatch something on a piece of paper before deciding whether or not it should go on your painting. Of course, you don't have to do this for every single part of the painting, but if you're thinking of a new colour, a new technique, you're uncertain if the thing that you're going to do is right for your painting, always try it out before you commit to using it in your painting. Now we come to a tip which I think is probably the most important tip I'm going to give you. It's not even a painting tip, it's about your underdrawing. Now, so many times I see on Facebook groups people asking for advice with their paintings. I'm doing this portrait, it's not quite right, I can't see what it needs. Do I need a little more shadow on the left side of the face? I'm not very good at getting realistic hair. Are the eyes the wrong colour? Should I perhaps put a background in? And I look at these questions and I look at the picture and I think none of that matters because your underdrawing is wrong. Now, watercolours are a transparent medium, and although I'm very big on this channel on telling you how to fix mistakes, there are a lot of mistakes you can fix. You really are going to struggle to fix a bad underdrawing. And one of the ways that a painting can completely go out of your control is if you get halfway through, you realise your drawing is wrong, and you start trying to fix that with the paint. Now, that might work with an opaque medium like oil painting or acrylics, but unfortunately with watercolours, you're heading to the territory where you're going to have to end up throwing it in the bin. So you can save yourself all of this heartache by making sure you're happy with the underdrawing at the start. Now, that does not mean you have to do a massively complicated underdrawing. For something like a landscape, it may just be as simple as 1 or 2 lines. And I do actually advocate for drawing complex areas as you go through the painting. For instance, if you have a brick wall, you can draw the shape of the wall. You don't need to draw the bricks in until later if you don't want to, because it can be tiresome to do all that drawing at the beginning, and it also can be just a little bit too much pencil on your paper. But it's more about getting the layout and the scale and the proportion and the things in the right place. If you're looking at your drawing and you're just thinking, well, I don't know, maybe it'll improve when I put the paint on it. I really hate to be the one to break it to you, but paintings never improve when you put paint on. All that colour is just going to highlight your mistakes. So just take your time over your drawing. If you find that your paper's always getting in a mess because you're erasing things time and time again, what I suggest is that you do your drawing separately on a piece of sketch paper, and then when you've got it right, you transfer it across to your watercolour paper. That way you have the freedom to work things out and your paper is still going to stay nice and clean. And if you're worried about your drawing skills, don't worry, I have you covered. I have so many drawing videos on this channel, full of really simple techniques that are going to help you to improve. Drawing is not all or nothing, and every little thing that you learn is going to get you a better drawing, which is going to get you a better painting. So do let me know in the comments which one of these tips you found most helpful, and if you have other tips for keeping control of your watercolors, then do leave those suggestions in the comments. We can all learn from each other and other people will be able to read your suggestions. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the description of this video. You'll find lots of free stuff in there. I've got some free downloadable PDFs that you can grab for no money whatsoever. I've even got a free watercolor painting course that you can take. And if you're looking to improve your drawing in order to improve your watercolor paintings, I've got a really popular video. In fact, I think it was my fastest growing video ever. It's going to give you 20 fast drawing tips. You can watch that video right now.